This is an extreme example of someone having had the rings off the front of the camera and not put them back in the right place. You're much more likely to find subtle variations of that where you find that the full range of shutter speeds and apertures don't seem to be available, hopefully with the meter cord still intact. So how do you go about dealing with a problem like this? Well, it's easy enough taking the rings off the front, because that's what someone's managed to achieve here without too much trouble. Getting them back in the right position's a bit trickier, but it's not impossible. So I'll show you what's involved in that. Start here, let's remove these rings. That screw has been sealed with lacquer. Which is a strange thing to confidently do when you're putting things back together incorrectly. You're probably best advised to put a little drop of acetone or similar on those screws before you attack them. Here I am just making sure that my screwdriver is very, very firmly engaged with the slot. We'll take the rings off the front of the camera. So let's have a quick look at these rings. Make sure that everything's here that should be. And it all appears to be present and correct. Put that to one side. Now the important thing to note with this is we need to get the rings back in the correct position. And the correct position means correct compared to the meter at the top of the camera. You'll see that this little red blob here, that's where the lacquer has been applied to that cord to stop it coming undone. When the shutter's set to B and set to f1.9, this wheel, I'm turning the wheel at the base of the camera here, this cutout, and therefore the red blob that we see here, should be facing to the front of the camera, like that. Obviously it was a mile away from there, even though the shutter was set at B, just because everything was a complete mess with this one. So if you have the meter off your camera, you obviously can check this rather easily. But if you don't have the meter off your camera, because there's no special reason to do that, unless you have a problem up at the top of the camera, I'll show you a handy alternative. With the meter here set at ASA 10, you can see the position that this dial sits in. This is with the shutter speed set to B and the aperture at f1.9. So it follows that if you get your dial to sit in that position at the top of the camera, there's a very good chance that that's where it needs to be to put your dials back here at f1.9 and B. So you don't need to strip the meter off the top of the camera to have a look to make sure you know where that pulley was, the gear here. You can assume that it's probably going to be correct. Now this alignment, you'll find a picture of that alignment in the service manual, which I've got right here. And this is page 8 of the Retina Reflex 3 service manual. And this is the midline of the camera through here, and you can see the angle that this thing sits at roughly with the ASA scale and the DIN scale. So if you get your dials to look like that, that's going to be the right position. However, let's go back to our ugly example here. This tab here is the one that couples to the shutter. That sets the film speed in the shutter, this one here. At that bottom position, that's the B setting. This may be a bit bent, that tab, but it'll probably function for our purposes. So with this set where it should be in order to couple correctly, we can put the shutter speed setting ring back in place. Now this has a series of crenulations, almost teeth there, and there's a wider one at the base there. Now that wider one needs to couple to that little tab, so that as you turn the ring it shifts the shutter speed. This one's not hooking behind that tab very well, because that tab is, as I thought, it's somewhat pushed down, so I'm just cheating there bringing that up. You shouldn't need to do that. That's better. A lot happier now. Now, if you turn this ring past B to the whole second side of things, you'll notice that this tab disengages from that slot and drops back in when you set it to the B position. The shutter speed stays set on B. Obviously it doesn't automatically give you 2 seconds, 4 seconds and so on. So we've got our shutter speed setting ring in the correct place. We're making sure we haven't disturbed our position of our meter. Let's have a quick look at the other components. Now these are very dirty and greasy, and they probably won't move smoothly as a result, but they'll probably move, so we'll just put them back together as though we've just finished cleaning them. Here's the front ring, if you like, and here is the aperture scale ring, and it's got a little hook on the ring at this point, which must couple to the end of this spring. So I'll just hook that spring on there. Stretch the spring out very slightly and hook this tab into its slot. So now we have our aperture scale ring here, which should be vaguely spring loaded. This is quite stiff because it's sticky. Let's pop that down there for the moment. Here we have the coupling ring. This is the piece that couples to the meter dial here through that little pinion, and this little wheel here counter rotates the shutter speed setting ring there and the aperture setting ring here through those teeth. So this thing sits on here like this. There's a little cutout here which you use to pop over that little pinion. And that should snap down into place. And I'm feeling that now. You can probably see this little toothed wheel here rotate as I rotate this thing. So what position does this need to be in? Well, this cutout here, let's get this in place. That little notch, there's a notch right there. Our cutout here, this cutout on the brass ring, needs to be right up against that notch. That notch needs to be clear. So we can hold that in our hand like that in place. this little thing here, this is what opens the aperture to the set to full aperture. It opens up your diaphragm and your shutter blades. So I'm sitting that in place, and I've got a little bit of space in here, probably about 1.5, 2 millimeters, 1/16 of an inch. So taking this in hand, I've got to get that wheel down in that hole without disturbing the shutter speed setting ring or the meter. And with a bit of a wriggle, it'll probably go on. Just checking the seating of that. No, it's not dropping on for us today. Let's have another go. You can take the 3 rings together and put them in place too, but then you really are dependent on getting your tab over there correctly. And since that tab's a little bit mutilated in this camera, we won't do that. Let's put that back there, that's in the B position. Making sure the brass spring is correctly aligned with that notch. Now there's a picture of this in the service manual too. Get this in place. Part of the problem here might just be that this stuff is a bit dirty and sticky. Alright, that dropped down into position. Now we've got 3 screws. 2 of them are identical, and the 2 identical screws go in these positions, and one of them is longer, and the longer screw goes down in that position. So I'll run those screws down. Now if we've disturbed nothing, we'll be at F1.9 and B at the top here. Our meter drum is correctly positioned there. If we rotate the meter wheel, you'll see that the drum moves at the top, and if we turn our shutter speed dial, you'll see that it counter rotates with the meter wheel, the aperture settings. So this is all looking considerably more promising than it was beforehand. This camera, I think the shutter, it sort of works when it feels like, in a very unhappy sort of a way. But that wasn't too bad, that worked okay. But that's how you'd get your rings back in the correct position on a Retina Reflex 3 if somebody has had them off and failed to put them back in the correct place. This brings forward the question of why would somebody take the rings off in the first place? Well, commonly if a camera has a fault with the shutter, people immediately start attacking it from the front, because that's typically what you do with shutters. Typically you're removing the front lens and then you start working your way back into the shutter. On these shutters you can't get into the shutter from the front, but that doesn't stop people who haven't got that knowledge. They'll remove these rings hoping they're going to get deeper into the shutter, discover to their dismay that they're going no further, and then they're faced with the task of getting the rings back in the correct position. And of course if they hadn't prepared for that, by setting the rings at a known spot, which is typically B and f1.9, with the film speed set to ASA 10, so you've got a good start position. If they didn't bother to do that, they've got no way of easily getting their rings back in the correct position without that little piece of knowledge. But so you can often find a camera where there's no particular problem at all, but perhaps the front rings were a little bit stiff and somebody opened up the front to see what they could do about that and got into the same silly position. But you can never tell. It's always a secret what other people have done to cameras and why they did it. Don't count on it making sense.